Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with some more Pioneer content here today. Today we're doing a versus video between Blue-White Control and a variant of Blue-White Control at least, and Hardened Scales, that Francisco, I can't even pronounce his last name, famous streamer who does primarily Primeval Titan content in Modern, played a black-green Hardened Scales version. We'll be playing his list versus one of our regular contributors, Space Marines Blue-White Control lists. As our friendly reminder, if you like what you're seeing on the channel, please consider subscribing, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below, as we aim to pump out some more Pioneer content, as well as continue to be the most informative lightning bolt based channel for Modern on YouTube. So, today's list, this is a Blue-White Control list by one of our control aficionados, Space Marine. The one thing about control in Pioneer, and to a lesser extent control in Modern, is the removal speed is abysmal as far as early interaction. In Modern, it's kind of covered up by the fact that Blue-White has access to Path to Exile, and then more recently on Thin Ice and Winds of Abandon. Previously to that, it was playing things like Oust and Condemn. None of those cards exist in Modern, or in Pioneer, so you're looking at cards like Last Breath, Azorius Charm, Blessed Alliance, what was the other one that Seal Away. You're really scraping the bottom of the barrel for like 1 and 2 mana removal. Space Marine has decided to run 3 copies of Azorius Charm and 1 copy of Warrant Warden. Both basically do the same thing as a removal spell. They put an attacking creature on top of the library since you won't be blocking a whole lot. In this deck, beyond that, Azorius Charm gives you the utility of being able to draw cards, as well as if you actually have creatures in your deck, of being able to give them lifelink. I guess in the sideboard you do have some creatures, but in the main deck there isn't a whole lot. Beyond that, you got some copies of Dovin's Vetoes, Absorbs, and Syncopates as kind of early defense against spells, and to a certain extent creatures. Teferi, Time Raveler, and Detention Sphere kind of come down and disrupt your opponent a little bit on turn 3, especially from creature threats, and then eventually on 4 mana you're reliant upon Supreme Verdict and Settle the Wreckage to kind of clean up creatures, which in a lot of cases that'll be fine. In certain cases, when your opponent has creatures that just sit back and do nothing, Settle the Wreckage may not be the best card to answer those things. Beyond that, you have some copies of Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, as well as Teferi, Time Raveler, and then copies of Glimmer of Genius and Sphinx's Revelation to round out your card advantage suite. Elixir of Immortality is your primary win con in this deck outside of Teferi. Basically, what this deck aims to do is to get to the point where your opponent's basically on 0 resources, you've killed all their creatures, their hand's empty, you're maybe on 5 or 6 life, you Revelation for 4 or 5, untap, and then kind of have a handful of cards, and then cycle through your deck with the Revs and the Glimmer of Geniuses, eventually resetting things with Elixir of Immortality and just decking your opponent. Outside of, Teferi, the Teferi loop is also a possibility. So there is no true kill your opponent win con in this deck. The sole objective of this particular list is to get to the stage where your opponent just gives up. Because otherwise, you're going to sit there and play a long game against an opponent who has no win cons, and not really much fun for anyone except those few stoic individuals that love winning like that, like Space Marine. Sideboard, got some different win cons, got some different things. Ashiok here as kind of a mill condition, as well as preventing searching, and can attack graveyards, which can be relevant. Dovin's Vetoes as 3rd and 4th copies of Negate, basically Disdainful Stroke against any type of big mana stuff going on. 2 Torrential Gearhulks. There isn't a ton of things to flash back in this deck. You've got like Settle the Wreckage and a bunch of counter spells, Azorius Charms and such, so I mean there's some decent amount, but not as much utility as like in a blue-black or a Sultai list or something along those lines. Blessed Alliance, pretty good against things like aggressive decks and burn and such. Won't be particularly good against the Hardened Scales deck, because the Hardened Scales deck, thanks to Animation Module and some other things, has the ability to go wide. So this is probably not a card we'd be bringing in this matchup. Last Breath. This is kind of a conditional removal spell. It's good against small hanger back walkers. It's good against Steel Overseer and Winding Constrictor in this matchup, at least before they start getting +1/+1 counters on it. So there's only a small window where this card might be good in the matchup, but it is something to consider. And also Sun's Champion as kind of like the premier mid-range killer, clogs up the board, can be a wrath effect in certain spots. Very powerful, but once again, probably not for this particular matchup, but still very, very powerful card. I probably wouldn't leave home without it if I were a blue-white control player in my sideboard, at least. I mean, there are other win cons you could run in the format, things like Etherling and so many other, various control finishers through the years from Return to Ravnica on. The problem really isn't a lack of finishers in this deck. The problem is the lack of good removal outside of the sweepers. So you're trading basically, saying compared to a blue-black list, you're trading better sweepers and decent counterspells for better removal. So if you're trying to build a control deck in the format, just keep that in mind as you're building your deck. Anyways, on to the deck tech for Hardened Scales. Alright, so here we are for Hardened Scales. For those of you who aren't familiar with the modern format, Hardened Scales is a deck built around the card Hardened Scales, and a lot of the tools are also present in Pioneer. Things that are missing are things like Arcbound Ravager and such, but this deck is still very powerful with what it's trying to do. The objective is to get a Hardened Scales into play or a Winding Constrictor, and then abuse +1/+1 synergies. Things like Animation Module, and anytime things come into play with a +1/+1 counter on it, you can pay 1, make a servo, go wide that way. Steel Overseer is just a very, very powerful card, especially if you untap with it with all these +1/+1 synergies. Rishkar, it's going to give you a burst of mana as well as the ability to spread out +1/+1 counters even further. So it can ramp you and also add to your synergies. And then Walking Ballista and Hangerback Walker really need no introduction. Hangerback Walker, comes in. It's not very mana efficient, but it is, it's basically a series of 2 bodies in one. So if you're playing against a Wrath deck, then, and they have 4 counters on it, suddenly you have 4 Thopters to attack them on the way back with. Walking Ballista is a good way to pressure Planeswalkers, finish your opponent off without the combat step, especially when you're abusing the +1/+1 counters with Winding Constrictor Hardened Scales. And then Stonescoil Serpent is an interesting one. It's kind of this deck's endless version of Endless one, but also has the bonus of being protection for multicolored. Some reason it has Reach, it has Trample, and it can be a 1-drop in certain situations, when you need to be a little more aggressive. And finally, Nissa, Voice of Zendikar. This is a very kind of underrated 3-mana Planeswalker after the whole series of other 3-mana things like Oko and stuff have been printed, but this is one of the most powerful 3-mana Planeswalkers that's kind of underrated. Your +1's making plants, which isn't a huge deal, but this does give you the ability to create an army in a can, minus the +1/+1 counters on it, pressure your opponent. Or if you happen to be flooding out and you hit the ultimate, you can draw 7 cards, gain a 7 life. So this is kind of their own version of Sphinx's Rev on the back end. It's pretty much the main deck. The only really utility thing in the main deck is Hashap Oasis as a way to punch a little bit of extra damage, maybe. And beyond that, all these copies of Animation Module and such. Deck's very much a synergy deck, so you really can't afford to sideboard out a whole lot, but as far as a sideboard, let's go ahead and cover that. Thoughtseizes and Duresses can come in against combo decks and to a certain extent control. The problem is when you bring in stuff against control, you're kind of taking out some of your synergies, so there isn't a ton that can sideboard out against blue-white control, other than maybe the Fatal Pushes and some other random things. Oh yeah, also forgot to cover Once Upon a Time. Pretty much if you're playing a green deck and has creatures in it, you're playing Once Upon a Time. Very, very powerful card. Being able to cast it for free, help fix your mana and such. 2 copies of Feed the Clans for the burn and aggro matchups. 2 copies of Evolutionary Elite for control decks or grindy decks. For Decaying Assassin's Trophy when you need to answer hard to answer permanents, Planeswalkers and such potentially. Tormod's Crypt and Grafdigger's Cage for Graveyard Hate. That's it. Let's get into the matches. Back here for Game 1, match number 1 of this versus set. And we're on the play. No, we're on the draw here. This hand's a little bit risky. We have 5 lands, we have a sweeper. I think this hand is good enough to go ahead and keep. Like I said, I'm not entirely sure of the speed of the format completely, so there's an animation module on one. See a syncopate, put it on the bottom. Really just looking for card advantage here at this point. They just play a Steel Overseer. We scry a Teferi to the bottom. They play a Walking Ballista. Do the animation module, pump it up. So, quite a bit of pressure on the table already. Minor mistake here, I should have played the Plains or the Hallowed Fountain to be able to hold up Absorb in case they play like a Nissa or something this turn. It looks like they're just going to go for the sweeper or bust plan. Force us to have a sweeper on 4 here. Because they are presenting lethal here. Yeah, that's definitely more than lethal they'll be presenting if they don't. So, it's important here to use Supreme Verdict because if you wait for Settle the Wreckage here, you will not get Steel Overseer and you won't get all the servos that they generate from it. So, still taking quite a bit of damage down to 9, but overall pretty clean exchange. They find a Steel Overseer, play it out, play a tap land. Well, at this point they're low on resources, so we just play a Teferi and tuck it. They have a Winding Constrictor. We just continue to plus along here. They play out a Walking Ballista. Go ahead and absorb that. Fortunately, this means we're going to lose Teferi here, but we do have another one in hand. So I choose to plus it, as opposed to tucking things, mainly because we have Settle the Wreckage. When it plays a Steel Overseer, just go ahead and Azorius Charm it to the top of their library. Once again, we decided to tuck this here because then we can use Field of Ruin to shuffle their library, get rid of both of those threats. So there's a chance they could draw air from here, and we should have a decent chance at covering most of their threats with Syncopate. Now we're just kind of entering the cleanup phase, and our opponent just scoops it up. So, at this point, this is what this deck's trying to do. You're trying to get to the point where you've answered all your opponent's threats, they only have a card or two in hand, you have a handful of counterspells and answers, and draw spells. The one risk, as you saw there, is if our answers don't line up specifically, like if our opponent had a Nissa in the mix, or something along those lines, or if we hadn't exactly had the sweeper on 4, we were just dead. So our opponent went in all in, trying to kill us before we could set up for a sweeper. Fortunately, we had the Supreme Verdict. But this is one of the balancing acts of at least the blue-white control lists early in the format, is when do you hold up counter magic, when do you go for a sweeper, when do you use a detention sphere, when do you... that's one of the tensions of playing a sorcery and instant speed game within the same deck. So, but Teferi, very powerful card here, kind of powered us through here. We did lose one, but obviously we have an Elixir somewhere in our deck, so it's not as bad. One of Elixir Immortality is fine. I think this format might be slow enough for blue-white control to emerge as one of the contenders, but I guess only time will tell. Anyways, on to sideboarding, game number 2. Back for game number 2 and the sideboarding before that. For this particular game, I only chose to bring in 2 copies of Last Breath to try to have a little bit more spot removal. I removed 1 copy of Warrant Warden and 1 copy of Glimmer of Genius. Kind of hedging, want to be able to catch an early Steel Overseer and an early Winding Constrictor. Maybe not get overrun like we did last game, or was the risk of last game, before we hit that Supreme Verdict on 4. This hand doesn't have any white mana. Field of Ruin's a little slow. I think because of the nature of how quickly their deck can explode, we don't want to keep this hand, so I did mulligan this hand. This hand's a lot better. The question becomes, what do we mulligan, or what do we put to the bottom of the deck? I think Last Breath and Teferi are important, Detention Sphere as well. So I think the putback is Dovin's Veto, because a lot of times they can get down their powerful cards before we could even hold up the Veto, because Hardened Scales is kind of their key card. And then their other card that they're worried about resolving generally against us is Nissa. So, and they usually can pick a spot, like, you know, where we've played our Teferi to resolve it. So for that reason, I go ahead and put the veto to the bottom. They play out a Hardened Scales. Pass the turn here. They have a Winding Constrictor. I just go ahead and last breath this here, since we don't have any other plays anyway. I don't want them to be able to sneak in another card. And just, you know, good old F6 value. So it looks like they don't have a Nissa here, which is nice for us. Go ahead and bounce it. Do have a Syncopate. They have a Once Upon a Time. Finding a Stone Coil Serpent, which ironically has protection from colorless, which could be annoying. They play out the Steel Overseer again. We put the card to the bottom. Plussing Teferi there. Go ahead and choose to Detention Sphere this, which may or may not have been correct. Could have tried to hold up counter magic here, because now they just resolve a large Hangerback Walker into the Stone Coil Serpent, which is annoying. We draw a Last Breath, which is nice. Play out Teferi here. Go ahead and plus Teferi, untap the lands. So our opponent attacks. Little Tef with the worm, with the Hangerback Walker. Big Tef with the Serpent. Go ahead and deal with the Serpent with the Last Breath here. Little Tef dies, but that's not a huge deal. Walking Ballista here could be annoying. So, looking for the Supreme Verdict here. Unfortunately, we've played our land for the turn. So Ballista is going to get to finish off both Planeswalkers. That's exactly what they do. They play a Hangerback Walker for 1. So it looks like here they're playing around Syncopate, and they may have been. I think we showed them Syncopate game 1, but I think the key was they're actually holding up mana for Walking Ballista. So they could get an extra counter, 2 extra counters on Hangerback Walker here, or get 2 extra counters on Walking Ballista. It looks like they want to go for the Walking Ballista plan. So they're going to pump their Walking Ballista here, and they could also have been playing around Syncopate potentially. Let's go ahead and cast Supreme Verdict here. They pump their Ballista, shoot us for some amount. Get some Thopters, play a Hardened Scales. There's the Stone Coil Weird. Stone Coil Serpent. I had accidentally passed through this turn, not thinking Syncopate would get to counter anything. So, when you're playing Magic Online, watch your F6s and such. That actually might buy us another turn. Go ahead and do this Glimmer main phase, looking for an answer. Bottom both of those. Fine to sell the Wreckage, so we got a little bit bailed out here. Attacks with everything, right into the Settle the Wreckage. They have 1 card in hand, don't play anything. We find the Search for Azcanta, which, as long as they don't resolve anything game-breaking this turn, should be more than enough to take over the game. A little bit slow, but our opponent's finally flooding out a little bit. We keep a Detention Sphere, activate Search for Azcanta. Find the Teferi. Both Teferi and Rev at this point are going to close out the game. Teferi in combination with Azcanta is going to let us see 8 cards a turn. So at this point the game's pretty well over. Our opponent's got like maybe 1 more turn to land something. And even then, for the most part, we should be able to answer it. And our opponent goes for a concession. Cool. So, this is what this deck's aiming to do. Trying to keep the board as clear as possible. You know, land some spells, land some draw spells, just kind of churn through your deck. And this is blue-white. This particular version of blue-white control doing what it does best. We did get to see a lot of what the Hardened Scales deck could do in game 1, how explosive it can be. It was threatening a turn 5 kill, which I think is pretty reasonable given the fact the deck does have a decent amount of disruption in the form of hangerback, or not hangerback walker, in the terms of walking ballista. A lot of the really quick Hardened Scales kills out of the modern version involved Inkmoth Nexus, which obviously this deck doesn't have access to. Also doesn't have access to the broken things like Mox Opal and such. So I think for a deck that's ported into another format, it's held up reasonably well despite missing some really key cards from that. But as you see, it still has some very powerful, very strong draws. And maybe in match number 2, we'll get to see more of what that deck's capable of. Back for match number 2, we'll be on the play, which is pretty sweet. Especially in this format. This hand looks pretty reasonable. We have 2 potential early interactive spells for creatures. Or Azorius Charm can also cycle, as we probably want our second blue source for Absorb. So overall, I think this hand's pretty good. Well, it leads off on nothing here. They play a Winding Constructor. We go ahead and cycle Azorius Charm here. Trying to hit land drops, holding up Absorb here again. Goes for the Winding Constrictor. Walking Ballista. I go for Supreme Verdict here, which may or may not have been correct. It's possible I wanted to hold up counter spells, but you know, they do have 2 creatures on board already, and with Winding Constrictor in play, things get pretty rough. And no matter when we go for the Supreme Verdict, they're going to be able to land a Nissa if they have it, so a little bit rough there, unfortunately. See a Baby Jace there and bottom it, or Baby Tef and bottom it. Opponent finds a Steel Overseer. They play Steel Overseer here. Activate their Nissa. This is where things get rough for the blue-white control side. We end up keeping both those cards. And Detention Sphering the Nissa, hoping to sweep their board the following turn, holding up a Syncopate. Animation Module is kind of annoying. Hangerback Walker is pretty brutal against a sweeper. They get to pump up the team. Go ahead and sweep away their board. They still have a bunch of 1/1s. They have another Nissa. They get to put a lot of pressure on the table. So they have 6/9 power on board when we just swept them last turn, leaving them with a total of 3 power. So, very powerful card, Animation Module, and Nissa. So, the deck does have some resiliency. I think our best plan here is to rev and hope to hit a sweeper. Opponents doesn't activate their Hap Oasis, figures we might have something here anyway. Go to 1, they make another plant. Don't necessarily agree with them playing out Hangerback Walker here. And if I wasn't priced into revving here, I think 1, 2, 3. No, I was priced into this play regardless, because even if I Glimmer here, I'd only be able to Syncopate for 2. And so, Revelation and Glimmer main phase. Bottom both those. Don't hit a sweeper, and we have way too much pressure in play. I don't think there's any... Cracking Elixir puts us up to 10. They have way more than 10 power in play. I could bluff something, but reality is we're dead, so kind of concede here. But that's one of the dangers. Like, you know, we saw 2 of our Supreme Verdicts already had swept their board twice, and yet they still had a bunch of stuff in play. So, you know, it's one of the risks of playing this blue-white control variant is if your cards don't line up right, you really don't have a lot of ways to recover. I mean, we did hit D-Sphere into Sweeper to clear up their board, and they still had Nissa, another Nissa floating around, so a little bit unfortunate there, but that unfortunately is a loss here in game number 1. On to sideboarding and game number 2. Back for game number 2 and match number 2. This time we choose to bring in all 3 of the last breaths, cutting an Absorb, a Glimmer, and a Warrant Warden. So Warrant Warden's a little bit restrictive with not the ability to cycle it. The 4/4 flyer at instant or at sorcery speed, not really relevant unless we have a Tef in play. Absorb, counter spells are nice. Maybe I should have be cutting the Dovin's Vetoes, but as you see, their deck can get under counter spells quite easily, especially the 3-mana counter spells. So I decided to cut one of those, cut a Glimmer, and cut the Warrant Warden, so we're not like disrupting our main game plan. The only other card that could potentially be reasonable would be Elspeth, and the problem with Elspeth is like we don't have the ability to really shut down their Thopters. The Walking Ballistas can get around and kill it. So while it could be reasonable tapping out on 6 for a card that may or may not end the game, just wasn't worth it. First hand wasn't good enough. This hand's at least interesting, especially on a mull to 6 already. I think the putback is one of the counter spells, because this is definitely a keep, especially with the Temple to dig us to another land. I believe I end up getting rid of the Absorb here. Yep. Mainly because we want to be attacking them on curve, got a bottom the Rev. They have a Once Upon a Time to find a Serpent. They have the Hardened Scales. They have another Hardened Scales and the Serpent. Which I suppose I could have syncopated there. There's a little bit of a pun on my part there, because that 3 power in play could be relevant. Although, I suppose with Syncopate I'm not particularly interested. So I take a bit of a gamble here. I choose to Detention Sphere their Hardened Scales, simply because that is a card that could get out of hand quite quickly. They, of course, have the Nissa to punish us. The thing with Nissa, though, is depending on the rest of their plays, she's not all that threatening on her own, but we were setting up the play of Supreme Verdict, hope to rip a land into Teferi, tuck the Nissa, and unfortunately they have the discard spell here to punish us for that line. And the Steel Overseer, which fortunately we have an answer for, although they knew that, so they're just trying to get it out of our hand. And at this point, just kind of, Nissa starts taking over the game a little bit for them. We go ahead and counter that. They are Hellbent. They play Hangerback Walker. So at this point, they decide to start getting aggressive with their Nissa. -7 won't do a whole lot. It draws them 3 cards, gains them 3 life. Whereas the minusing puts, you know, with the Hardened Scales in play, starts really pumping up the power. They've got, what, 4 power here alone, and then another 4 power coming next turn. And even if we happen to rip a Supreme Verdict off the top, you know, just pass the turn here, try to counter their thing, and then we know we're just dead on the backswing. So, for those of you wondering why I Detention Sphered the Hardened Scales, just because it so exponentially speeds up their clock. It might have been incorrect. Maybe I'm supposed to keep that as an answer to a Nissa or something. But imagine them having 3 Hardened Scales in play and any type of booster. It gets really silly really quickly, gets out of hand. And like I said, at any point, if they commit enough to the board that we have to Supreme Verdict, they're going to land that Nissa anyway. It's one of the disadvantages of playing specifically the blue-white control lists. If you don't have a lot of convenient ways to answer planeswalkers or non-creature permanents really outside of Detention Sphere. So you got to see the dichotomy of both decks. Like game 1 or match 1, you got to see the blue-white deck do what it does best. Match number 2, you got to see some of the awkward tension with playing the style of blue-white control list, and why it requires a greater degree of skill to play these no-win con kind of blue-white control lists. Anyways, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. If you like what you're seeing on the channel, please consider subscribing, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below. And there will definitely be some more Pioneer content coming out. I think I'm going to be working on an actual Burn League in Pioneer, as well as continuing the uh, Infinite Challenge for Magic Online for Modern Boros Burn. And anyways, I want to thank everybody for tuning in to the content, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.